Okay, anyone there?
Yeah.
I don't know if it was 20 already or more, but maybe we can slowly start getting back on track. There's still a lot that we can potentially cover. So, okay, so I don't know if you had a chance to have a quick playthrough, maybe.
Yeah, I had a little bit of a go of it.
Okay. Any questions about, like, more specifically about Submarine? Because we could talk about, more about the game loop, more about UI, more about graphics, more about audio, more about AI. Like, there's a couple of practical tricks that I can share with you. Maybe that might make your life easier. That's why one of the reasons I was kind of put myself in your shoes for this is just see what practical things that I might not be thinking about that I might give to you. So I could tell you a little bit more about what I've done with the audio, with the UI. So maybe a tip and trick in with GIMP or with Audacity. I don't know if you're familiar with those tools.
Yeah, would have used Audacity a bit in the past.
Okay, great.
You're mentioning GIMP though, so
Yeah. Okay. Well.
what would you use it for in this case? Or
Well.
say it or Photoshop?
Yeah. I mean, sure. Photoshop is fine. If I don't know if you don't have the license, it doesn't make a big difference. They're both very similar. In some cases, I found actually GIMP makes some things easier, like exporting PNGs with alpha channel or something that Photoshop happened not to do well. So I don't know. Like, don't knock it. It's a free tool, so in some cases you might it might be handy to. So in this case, I think I'm going to just the health bar was one of the. Well, I had to do a couple of little texture assets for this. Obviously, this is all very minimal and retro style, which made it easy. But the logo here is done plainly in game using a font I found, which was kind of a Psygnosis styled font. So Text Mesh Pro is part of Unity, and it allows you to do quite fancy things like gradients out of the box. So outlines, diffuse text, and all that. So I don't know. You probably used it before. It has a somewhat of a kind of a flow where you have to create a text mesh asset, which is basically a material, a text atlas, a glyph atlas gets created for a font that you specify, and then that's being used by TextMesh Pro. So this is a bit more efficient and also higher quality. It generates those distance fields around every letter, allowing you to on the fly change outlines and do kind of like interesting effects. So quite nice to kind of get into. For the health bar here, as you can see, there's not much to it other than it's a graphic with a gradient and a little bit of alpha mask. So let's have a quick look in my textures folder here. What exactly happened with it? So I have the health bar. It's actually set up as a sprite, and why? I'm just going to tell you right now. Any idea why, maybe? Why do I need it as a sprite? Because
for scalable?
no, actually in this case, because Unity gives you something out of the box which is called filled images. So you can actually do something like a progress slider pretty much for free. Let's have a look here. This is the game overlay, which is here in a canvas group that I can fade in and out. This is handy. Canvas groups allow you to group several components and control the opacity of them together. So use them in coroutines to get nice transitions. In the info panel under health, I have just one image component. which takes this sprite called health bar, and it has a setting because it's been set to image type filled. Now all you need to do is fill amount, and you can do this. So I don't know if you've tried that trick before, but very handy. There's different types as well. There's sliced and tiled. That's maybe not in this case particularly, but there is a different types of fill methods as well. Radial. So you can do kind of progress bar, waiting, loading graphics with that very easily. So it's just a kind of a practical tip. I don't know. Does it look familiar? Have you used it before? Or?
Wouldn't have used the fill amount before. We've done a few things with sprites in other contexts.
Cool stuff. Yeah, sprites. So more usually you'd want to slice them to have backgrounds with borders for your UI elements, for example. Like in this case, for example, I've set it all up. Well, let's spend a little moment here on the UI just in case to make sure everybody's on the same page. So I have one kind of a panel here which is stretched to the entirety of the screen, but you don't kind of see it. And then there's info panel, and that is a, let me see, because game overlay is alpha 0 now, so okay, so I have an info panel which basically makes sure that it stretches horizontally and moves to the top. So, and within that I placed kind of a sub panels here, health, let me see. So there's a sub panel here for health and sub panel for score. This image just shows you where the placement of it is, and then based on that it's all hierarchical, so you know the underlying elements you can use the justification based on different options here. So probably familiar with it, but pressing Alt and Shift here allows you to have different anchoring options. So not enough time to really go into all of that, but if you haven't already, but this is where it's at. So maybe if you want to have a quick refresher, go in the setup that I've done and play with it, see if you can change it to something that suits your purpose better. I think that's not a bad way to go around it. And now how did I do this image? Because it's definitely it has an alpha channel. That's not something that you can kind of like do immediately with Microsoft Paint. So first of all, I imported it as a sprite. As you saw, you need the sprite editor. You don't actually need to do any slicing or tiling in this, but it needs to be defined as a sprite anyway to be able to do the filling effect. I see in newer versions of Unity, to be able to run the sprite editor, you actually have to import the package sprite 2D. So you'd have to go here in package manager, 2D sprite, and this package needs to be installed. So yeah, this used to be kind of built in, so something's changed. Okay, so just very quickly, how did I do this little variable opacity image? So let's say make a sample 512 by 512 image. The one I used for the help panel was obviously much smaller. I'll use GIMP, but actually the procedure is going to be fairly similar for Photoshop. So Windows, let me show a new toolbox. Okay. Let me also show dockable dialogues layers. Layers will be necessary. And tool options. So first of all, and also gradients. So let's start with making a little gradient, which might be handy for different situations. So new gradient, untitled, and we have a gradient editor where we can click on a segment, split segment at midpoint. I don't know if that's visible. Okay, maybe I'll just. So now we have two segments, left and right. And now if I right click on this, I can set the right endpoint's color to whatever I desire, red or whatever, and OK. Then left endpoint color maybe to blue. Okay, and now here, right endpoint of this segment, let's make it orange. And to match them, this segment, you can do load left color from left neighbor's right endpoint. And this will match them. So now I have a new gradient that I can now use. I can use it here using the gradient tool. I can have a linear gradient. I can have a radial gradient, whatever you feel like. So let's make a combination of this. Let's say, okay, I'm happy with this. Sorry, stop. Oh, I switched the visibility. That's not wise of me. Okay, and now I'd like to create an alpha mask for it. So in GIMP, let's make a new layer. Okay, and let's make a black and white gradient. Let's say something like this, where black would be the area of least opacity, transparent, and white would be the area of highest opacity, opaque. So I've created this layer. I'll just copy it all, and now I can even delete this layer. I have it in my I have the copied image already. So here on this layer that I'd like to add a layer mask, I do an add layer mask. Let's say we start with the white. Okay, and here show layer mask. Okay, so I've hidden this layer because it was getting in the way. So now if I have a green outline here on the mask, I can just paste what I had there before and anchor it down. Right now it's showing me the mask only, so I can disable editing layer mask and disable showing layer mask. And you can see we have now an image which has transparency. Now all we need to do is to export it to our project. Goes into textures, some kind of gradient. I don't know, if you're making some coder graphics for your game, this is probably the kind of a workflow that you'll run into. And that's it. Let's close GIMP and never mention it again. In the meantime, back in the game, I have the image, but it's not properly set up to accept the transparency from the image. So I have to force that. So alpha is transparency, and then apply. Now I have the image and I can use it. Well, one thing that we might want to use it for is convert it to a sprite again. Cool, and let's say we'll add it to our game overlay. Yeah, need to apply it. I'll add this image here. And now we have a full screen image that gets in the way of everything else. But it works, it scales. You see that it faded out because it's part of that UI canvas. So anyway, I think that's enough about image assets. So let's have a quick look at the audio, because I haven't talked about it a lot yet, and there's quite a lot happening too. So as you notice, there's a kind of a music that is randomized for both the titles and the in-game. So it's there's a couple of well, first of all, there's the Audio Master object here, which is our main controller for audio. So just to organize it, I called it Audio Master, and it contains a couple of other objects. What does it do? Well, it holds a couple of arrays. It's like with our buildings. I want to have indices to tracks, and then kind of combine them. So I want to have an atmospheric track, a rhythm track, and a lead track from like within their corresponding sets. So we pick one lead track, one rhythm track, and one atmospheric track, and hope that this sounds anyway decent. So how do I see this? So title timeline, title tracks. Let's open the timeline. So there's a couple of title tracks, and we just this one is always played. It's the kind of main special effect, dramatic kind of opener, and then there's a couple of kind of slightly cyberpunky kind of Blade Runner-ish tracks here, which are getting combined together. Meanwhile, in the in-game is a little bit more complex. There's more tracks. The reason I use timeline is that it does give you a synchronization between audio tracks for free and quite efficiently. The drawback is that you cannot have full control over individual tracks. So you could do it using a mixer. You can. There's many ways of doing it. The way I did is actually binding different tracks to the main camera or to a black hole output object. Maybe it's a little bit let's see. To look at timeline, I actually have to. So now you can see that I've highlighted the title time. Okay, now I'm in the in-game timeline, inside the game, and I see that there's some of these tracks have been assigned to black hole and some of them to main camera. The reason, the difference there is that for tracks assigned to black hole, they go to a muted channel on the mixer, and tracks assigned to the camera the audio source is on the camera is going to the playing channel on the mixer. Quicker look at the mixer, what's happening there. So it has two channels. So the master channel obviously is the master volume for everything that's coming out of the game, and then I have playing channel, which is at regular loudness, and muted channel, which is always muted. So that was my way of working around that you cannot really mute tracks on the fly with timelines, unfortunately. And I didn't want to play all of them at the same time. There doesn't seem to be one very elegant way to do it. There's different approaches. So you can either have several audio sources and have different sets of clips, and make sure that you synchronize those audio sources. Or you can use timeline, then they're synchronized, but you cannot have the full control over its muting. Or maybe you can play them all and have a lot of channels in your mixer. Or maybe you want to use a third-party audio asset. So like depends on what your needs are. You know, this is probably a bit more complex than the usual, because I wanted to have the dynamic mixing, kind of like a procedural soundtrack that changes. Feel free to use those audio tracks. They're from a game I released 2 years ago, so use them for this project. Maybe if you want to do something else with them, ping me and we'll check with the artists. So, like a quick overview of any bit of audio processing. Well, I didn't do a lot. I used this library, Freesound library, which you might be familiar with. Very nice place to find different types of sounds. So I did use some retro game sounds from there. I processed them slightly so that they're not obvious. But yeah, usually you have to like give them attribution. There's Creative Commons license, whatever. So make sure if you release something to the bigger world, make sure that you respect copyright. But a great asset for the indie game. Audacity, I did mention that, so some of you have used it. It's a free cross-platform audio editing tool, which is actually quite powerful and no nonsense. So a typical workflow would be to maybe get some waveform. This is already an OGG file, but let's say, okay, this is a wave that we downloaded from somewhere or recorded, and we'd like to make it ready for using in Unity. So first of all, look what the sampling rate is. Like let's say if we started off at 44 kilohertz, then it might not be necessary. Then what you can do in Audacity is resample the track. So I can resample it. Let's say I resample it to 16 kilohertz. Normally 22K is quite okay. I mean, not all of us, not many of us will hear the difference between 22 and 44, but maybe with some bits of additional processing, some artifacts might actually be audible. So 22 is actually quite a safe. Okay, so some effects that you can add. Maybe there's a wah-wah effect or something that you can add on it, and things will sound a little bit different. You can amplify, make sure that the sound isn't too loud. Unity, within Unity you can also assign volume, so it's not a big problem if you already have a let's say an OGG file. So now export audio or export selected audio, and you can export it preferably as OGG Vorbis, which is a lossless compression file format like MP3. Well, maybe it is lossy, but it depends on your setting. Have a quick look at the audio master code just to see what's happening there. This part is probably the most obscure what I had to do for this whole game because of trying to get the tracks to mute or not. So indeed I have to get playable assets, so I have to deal with the timelines directly, which is maybe not the nicest thing to do. But the core of it is if the track, if we want the track in the game, then we set the binding from the timeline to the playing output. If we don't want it to play, we bind it to a muted output, and that's all. the unfunny thing about timelines and playable graph is that you actually need to recompile it before these changes. That's the main kind of problem, is that the whole thing is kind of compiled and only then played. So you need to rebuild the graph. Otherwise, you can use this whole system in full, or maybe just have a simpler audio setup. Some other things that Audio Manager does is plays special effects. So I have a separate audio source just for special effects, and anybody can call this play effects method using the clip number. So there's a small library of clips, like collect coin sound, or hurting, or win sound, or lose sound, and we just play it on the audio effects source. With this stuff you have to be careful, because some of the effects might be playing at the same time. So in this case you might want to have more than one audio source for different sources of different types of effects. Okay, so let's get back to our main game. We've talked a little bit about assets and kind of like peripheral stuff, but let's get back to how actually the game gets populated with points and baddies. Have you had a look yet, or any ideas? What's our main script to go to for generating stuff in our game? Anyone? Who spawned all those places, and who knew where to spawn them?
Be the city builder, was it?
Well, actually, well, yes and no. In this case, it's the actual tile script. So the road, the tiles that we're walking on is actually, I found this to be the best place to handle things like spawning. The only thing is that you need to kind of have control over how many of these items you spawned. So this is done via like just a simple communication between the game controller and each tile. So that's why I had to add this is the root tile script. And if you have a quick look here in its update function, if city manager nav mesh ready, and my slope is 0, so if it's a flat tile, and if the nav mesh has been already baked, and if the game state is game, then if the game state is not equal to game, then we spawn agents. So these are the little capsules that are flying in the intro. So that doesn't interest us as much. But this section, for example, spawns baddies. So if we are in the game, then we check for a couple of things. Among them are like special flags like, has this tile spawned a baddie before? Or my slope, is this tile a flat tile, safe to spawn something on? Or game controller, are baddies needed? Because maybe you already have 5 baddies in the level and we don't need any more. So, and also, is the navigation mesh ready? So those things need to kind of be in place before we can spawn. And even if this is all true, we still randomize so that it doesn't happen deterministically. It just happens very rarely, because we know every frame this gets checked, so we don't want it to spawn too fast as well. So this is a kind of an example, and the same pretty much is done with patrol targets for the baddies. The only thing is that we register them with a game controller. So once we come up with a target, we create a new prefab, we instantiate a prefab with the cone, and then we register that position with the game controller. So it's a kind of a controller client relationship type of thing. That's why we have so many flags here in game controllers, because of silly things like this. For the baddie, for example, maximum number of baddies, how many baddies are already registered, are baddies needed. This is a public static bool, so this is easy to check here without having too many references. So just as another example of using a static variable is inside root tile, game controller baddies needed. There's no reference to a specific game controller. I'm not using an instance. I'm just accessing the baddies needed variable directly. So it's just a shortcut. So that should kind of start giving you an idea, like how the game world gets generated, how we kind of maintain the flow in it. There's still obviously a lot we can hone in. So I've gone through baddie, I've gone through the player, yeah, okay. Okay, which other part you'd like to hear more about? The procedural generation. Did I talk about the grid view? I don't think I've gone in detail about it, right? So I found that when trying to troubleshoot the city generation, I could obviously see what's been placed in the city, like the prefabs that I place, but I wasn't necessarily always sure if the location of the array is correct. So this type of stuff is a little bit more difficult to troubleshoot, because maybe we want to spawn a building somewhere and something is already there. So adding this grid, I'm sorry, like I apologize, did I already go through this bit? Because
I think you did.
I did. Okay, so I talked about layers, how the grid view basically can be enabled here in the, I think I did. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you talked about how.
Okay, cool. So
you just.
So I used.
Oh yeah, sorry, just.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. So yeah, this allowed me to kind of isolate some specific edge cases. For example, this was giving me trouble because when you do a downslope, you not only need to check the area where you want to place the block, but also it's good to check this area, because what if there was something there already, some different building, something coming on from top, whatever, then you'd have an impassable area. So in order to make sure that our game will be playable after all, we need to check this slot in the array and this slot, and then place ones or true in the corresponding array locations. Another thing that I've done here is I've actually cleared out the inside of the temple. You don't see it here from the grid view, unfortunately, because while it's easy to set, like create a new prefab, it's not that easy to get rid of it after if you don't want it. I mean, like I could have done a more complex structure to do it, but it's not really kind of worth it. But believe me when I say that the inside actually has zeros in it. It's just that I put the zeros after I put the ones. So in the game you can actually see now that okay, I'll stop this. That there is stuff. It's accessible. The temple now is open to the public. So this this is also kind of an approach that I think you need to adopt for your own version of the city. Is when you create different types of buildings, you need to kind of see how they all come together and not all end up in one location. I think you can kind of clearly see that there is it's accessible. Let me, yeah, okay, I disabled the view, and I can see that part of the area is now accessible, and the roads and buildings are here under this nice roof. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of, okay, making the city yours. Create setups like this that procedurally maybe you will get a kind of a shelter underneath a large mega structure or something like this. Makes the whole thing much more interesting. I think it also, okay, I'm gonna die. Quick question for you. Maybe you've noticed when you played it a little bit, if I don't move when the baddie attacks me, let's say the first time that the baddie attacks me, come here. Well, come here now that here. So first time that the baddie attacks me, you lose a little bit of health, but then nothing happens for a long time.
Is it because you're using on trigger enter?
That's right.
So
yeah, good stuff. So yeah, I'd have to, if I wanted it to be a little more logical, I'd have to do on trigger stay. Good job. On the other hand, it kind of like maybe load balances or difficulty balances the game. So maybe it's not such a bad thing to have, because otherwise you'd have 5 baddies attacking you, die right away. This gives you a chance. So, you know, these kind of arbitrary choices. So let's have a quick look at that monolith thing, the temple, because like I said, the 15% of the course grid is was supposed to be lab 2, let's call it creative exercise 2, and how I understand it, what I need from you is basically what you would need to be doing for your final game anyway, which is playing with the procedural placement of buildings and maybe creating different types of buildings. So take the turtle assignment into 3D with a little sandbox that I'm giving you there, or maybe some code that you created yourself. That's the main idea. Like I want it to be like a fun way to, you know, get a few points, and at the same time, you know, maybe learn a bit more coding, experiment. I know you have lots of other assignments, so we can negotiate on the deadline for this if things are looking really dire. So we have a shadowed area here, and we can kind of see things in a different perspective. I don't know. I think it's, if you start getting emergent kind of different outcomes like this, that's interesting. This was a little bit, no, it was still fine, it was legit, so nothing illegal happened. You see, the maze that gets generated is actually quite complex. If you wanted to do it by hand, you'd probably have to spend a lot of time, and instead this will happen automatically. So I know the code is a little bit nasty to kind of get into, but once you understand it, you can push it in all kinds of ways. Alright, I was going to talk to you about the monolith, so let's have a look at the monolith code. So monolith has a start and end transform, and I did that last week. I did a little bit of live coding. So there's a, you basically give it 2 corners and it will stick that block in between. So what I added is another smaller block which fills in, basically carves out the space inside to allow those other buildings to come in. It isn't the prettiest code, and it was all a little bit eyeballed because as usual, I was really keen to get that kind of effect, but I ran into some debugging issues, and this was very late or very early, depending how you look at it. So this code you already might have seen last week. I added the stuff where you actually set certain slots of the city manager to 0. The only thing is you need to set up the extents for this, basically the cube or you know, like a rectangle or what's the geometrical figure name now? I'm being, well, let's say it's a kind of a perpendicular structure of zeros, and I decided that the zeros need to go to 2/3 all the way to the side of the height of the structure. So if you look at it this way, I just look at this array block and I said, okay, if we clear out everything to the 2/3 of height, then probably will be fine. And then I also made sure that there's a little bit of a margin on both sides. So I had to make 2 blocks across, one across along the Z coordinate, and then cut another hole along the X coordinate, like this, just to make sure that this is actually empty, and at the same time that no buildings are generated where the legs of the structure are. Maybe there's a little, no, I actually think it worked okay. Like, I don't see any problems here. So what did I do? I calculated the width of the structure based on what I've already earlier prepared. So I have top right far index and bottom left near index, and width in Z, along Z, and the height. And then when I set up my nested loop with X, Y, and Z, I just added some offsets. So I took the bottom left position on X, but I added 1/5 of the width. And then here when I finished, I cut just a short by 1/5 of the width. I did a similar thing for Y, so I went from floor level to 2/3 of the height. I know it's probably very illegible on your screens now, but you know where to find it in code, and kind of like I think once you get an idea what I'm trying to do, it's much easier to find out, you know, what the code actually does. There's nothing super, you know, rocket science about it. It's just that it is there's a lot of variables, but I try to name them in a way that they make some sense for you. So at the end of the day, all these slots have been then zeroed out, and the reason why the, okay, let me go to City Manager. Yeah. I'm getting, okay, sorry. Oh, okay, good. So the reason why the blocks aren't zeroed in the visual representation is that I only instantiate the grid visualization prefab if we put a 1 in place. Now if I wanted to clear them out, I'd have to like have probably another array holding all those objects and whatnot, so or do some kind of collider based stuff, which also I didn't want to go into. So for now, just believe me that those blocks are cleared. I can see how you can do a lot with this grid parametric block. You can, for example, I place them by hand in a way that I put those extents in the scene by hand. But imagine, like with the turtle assignment, that you could actually use numbers to decide on those points. Like I build one block, and then I build another one on top of it this way, and I can then position them relative to each other in a different ways. So it's a different approach. No recursion, but you can also make a more broad strokes in the design of the city. Maybe a big mosque with minarets is futuristic something. Or a particularly elaborate section of the space station or whatever. Okay. Okay, any questions? Anything that catches your attention? I think I got all your repositories. Let me have a quick look. Lasith is not with us. I had a question for him. Okay, I'll have to ping him otherwise. Okay, so okay, about nice touches. Okay, I think I broke something, so definitely this overlay shouldn't start with alpha 1. So if we go back to our menu and have a look at some of those text elements, how do we make it a little bit more sexy? And like for example, this flashing line of text. Again, it's very simple, but it does add some little bit of a character to the game. It feels a little bit more like a coin-operated machine. So let's have a look. So this press key, we can probably, if you were looking for it, you can probably deduce that it's on the UI canvas and it's the press key element. And you can find there, if you look hard enough, it has a little text pulse element. So this is a small little chunk of code that doesn't even need a start and update function. What's maybe interesting about this one is, and I think that's worth a little mention, is so I'm using ondisable and onenable to manage coroutines execution. Why? Because coroutines actually get destroyed if an object gets disabled and enabled. In this case, it isn't. It actually the title overlay stays active. I don't switch it on and off in the game, but maybe at some stage you decide that you want to disable this whole element, and then this will kind of wreak havoc on other components that are on the scene. So what I've done here is that it will detect whether the component itself is being disabled or enabled, and if it's being disabled, then its flashing coroutine is being forcefully stopped if it's not null, if it exists, and then when it's enabled, then if there's a coroutine running, then we stop it, and then we start another one. So that's just a kind of like a sanity checks to make sure that we don't have null references and the thing stopping to do anything. So this is the actual flashing coroutine, and it should start to look very similar now, or familiar. We take a start time, we calculate an end time, we zero the element we want to start from 0. This is an important kind of a step here, and actually I missed out something. Well, okay, in this case it's flashing, so it doesn't really matter, but if this was going from 0 to 1, it's also important to go to make sure that at the end of the coroutine you add the final value. There, you set it. Why? Because here, if you evaluate things from curves, maybe you will evaluate just a little bit short of 1, and you'll end up with a very faint ghost of something that should be completely disabled, and so on. So just make sure, if you use this kind of structure, just make sure that you double check that you have the final value that you want after you exit it. So in here, this is a while true loop, so it will just carry on forever flashing that image. It's using a flashing curve, animation curve, so I already showed you how to do that as well. Okay, I didn't go into the AI aspects of it yet. I think I did mention the raycasting, correct?
Yeah.
I did, okay. Sorry, I'm slightly losing track of what I've already covered, not because I'm doing it twice. So here. This bit of code, I assume I have talked about it. So a regular patrol, yes, we fixed this. Sorry, this is...
Sorry, Rob.
Yep.
Just that regular patrol bit that you had to in, is that
Yep.
part of the if statement, or is that outside? I'm not seeing the
Sure.
curly brackets.
Well, you see, this is no, it's not part of it. So you can kind of look at it like this. There's no curly bracket. It's just a single statement. So what?
Do you not need curly brackets on single statement?
No, if
then,
it's single
for next
statements.
I've just
That's
always
the
put them in
that's the
as
thing.
habits, so I
The
wasn't sure
actual
what it required.
for if and a lot of other statements. We're talking syntax now, yeah, and kind of like the grammar of C# and other languages, is that this needs to be followed by a statement. And the thing is, like, just one statement, but that statement can be a compound statement, which is what the curly brackets do. So basically, you can
Sorry, Rob.
yeah.
Are you showing us something at the moment? It's
Oh, sorry.
I think your stream is minimized, or it's just on
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. I
on
was
screen.
showing. Yeah, sorry. Back to it. Okay.
Yeah, I can see it now.
Right. Okay. So what I was showing is that if it's a single statement. Okay, it's not that easy. Okay. So what this okay, so you're asking about this, yeah? I left the indent because basically this is still part of the if, right? But technically this could have been done in one line, for example, or you could just have it bracketed and just have it ready in case you decide to
So
add.
jumped across there, Rob, again.
I'm just
if you move it to the left. There, thank
Okay,
you.
sorry. So yeah, if you later decide to add more statements there, then the curly bracket is already in place. So yeah,
Okay,
no,
thanks
no
very much.
error, no error there. The only thing is, okay, you were asking whether it's the regular patrol. Well, think about it. It this whole thing has to be executed if we have some kind of a hit on the physics raycast. So if we hit it and it's a player, then we start chasing. But if if statement ladders are the first thing to confuse one, like yeah, just so.
Yeah, I think I get the rest of it. Is
Yeah,
just
I'm
curious
just
about
making
the
sure
regular patrol.
myself that I didn't go too fast on this. This is kind of like this type of stuff is usually where it's very easy to get bugs because you kind of branch off. So what this needs to basically do is okay, if we hit the player and it's a regular patrol, then we change destination, start chasing. If we hit anything, okay, so actually it's a good thing that you've brought it up because of the situations that this might happen, because this might give us a hit on a building, for example, and then we're not taking care of the right situation. So what really needed to happen here is if we're hitting the player, yeah, I don't think this is correct. I have a bad this is a fishy thing going on there. Well, maybe you can help me talk through it. So what needs to happen basically? The baddie aims at the player, so the baddie actually always knows where the player is. That's, you know, it holds its position in a variable, so it's just kind of making the pretense of it finding it. So we just need to make sure if there's anything blocking the way between the baddie and the player. So if we get this statement, if the physics raycast returns something, it could be a player or it could be a building. So if hit collider tag is player and it's a regular patrol, then we start, yeah. And this is a situation which was supposed to request patrol target. Okay, so what happened here is actually I got the wrong else, or the wrong if. And apologies for that, but maybe this will encourage you to be careful in situations like that. So if we don't detect the player, but we are chasing the player, then stop chasing the player. I think that's more fair, right? So the only situation where we need to update the baddie destination is if we are on regular patrol and we're hitting the...
It wouldn't ever go to the else if statement, though, would it? If it's just checking, if it's just checking if a raycast has been done, if is it not doing the raycast anyway? So it would always be true for the first statement.
The physic raycast returns a true if it hit anything. So if it doesn't hit anything...
But it'll always be hitting something. If it's not the player, then it's just going to be something obstructing the player.
Yeah, you're right. So no, I've gone too paranoid. I think. Sorry, I'm just a bit. So if it hits the player, and it's not sure why it's stumping me now, but I thought this sounded logical when I was writing it. Just sometimes it gets so. So if we get a hit, and it's a player. Yeah, this is a situation where like a little sketch of the cases, because we might be already chasing the player, or we might be on a regular patrol. So
when it's chasing the player, it's not on regular patrol. So would that not mean that after a certain amount of time, it would just request a new patrol target anyway, even if it can still see
it would, but yeah, so we could like do nothing. But I think the idea was that if we hide, if we hit. So I would maybe break this up so that it's clear to read. That first of all, we check if we hit collider as player, so that makes it a bit clearer what we're dealing with.
Sorry, Robert's jumped across again.
Did it? Oh.
Or just a few.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have the preview in it. This is kind of clunky. Alright. Okay, I'll keep it at this lumen because like seeing it at kind of like this magnification just kind of doesn't make it easier. So if hit collider is equal player, and then I'm gonna have another if. So that's actually fair because we do want to be updating the nav agent destination when the player is moving around. So if regular patrol, actually we don't need to check, we don't care. If we hit the player collider, we need to update the destination. That's it. Always. Otherwise it will kind of keep searching for an old position of the player. However, if it doesn't hit the player and it's chasing the player, then go back to regular patrolling. I think this is only correct now. So it wasn't entirely correct that check for regular patrol made it so that it would notice you and then chase you only up to that position. So actually now we made it much harder on the player. But well, maybe it's good that we ran into this. It's again, there's lots of situations like this. Unless you really take it slow and plan, this was quite a quick sprint to get this kind of completed in time for the lecture. So let's try it now and see what happens with those baddies. Yeah, so if it sees me, it tries to find me. If it doesn't see me, or it goes beyond a certain range, it goes back onto its other patrol route. But let's check what happens when it actually does see me. It seems to be following me up fairly accurately. So this implementation, I think, is the optimal one, because I'm still able to hide, hopefully. Oh, it found me, bastard. Okay. Well, anyway, it's workable. Going back to the game loop, because I think we kind of split off at some stage and I didn't get to through the whole lot of it. Let's go back to game controller, and I think, yeah, we must have been somewhere around this area. Okay, so we instantiated the player, we set up max health, so back to our game loop and the overall kind of flow of the game code. I know we had lots of digressions, but the next thing, we changed the camera to player centric, so we start following the player and set up the correct components. So here the following script that flies the camera around just needs to get the appropriate camera target and camera position. We update the UI in Score UI, and we say, okay, it's okay to start spawning baddies. So we set up our static field baddies needed to true, and now from now on the root tiles, if the conditions are right, they will be spawning baddies. Yeah, and registering them with the game controller. Then we stop the camera move, we transition the UI, we wait for 2 seconds as well. So the advantage of doing this game loop in a coroutine is that you have full control over the timing there. Reset audio, do a little fade out, and then play in-game music. And here we come to the heart of the game. So that's the main game loop logic, and that's all it is here. We check if the player health state doesn't go below 0, and we check if player loot goes above or is equal to the maximum values. That means that we collected all points. Depending on that, we change the game state to game over or congrats. So you can see what happens. Remember, the setter there was doing something with the UI probably. So that's the only thing that actually changes, is that we display something for a moment. Another thing that changes is in the main update loop. This state is taken, so every frame we need to remember that some things are still happening every frame, like checking for inputs. So if we're in game over or congrats, we have this catch-all state for both of them. I don't know if you've seen this before, like in a switch statement, you can actually have two cases grouped together. Which this means is that I don't care if it's game over or congrats, I don't want to do this code twice, it's the same. So if it's game over or congrats, I'm waiting for escape key. So the only thing I'll respond to here in the game loop in the update method is if somebody presses an escape. Okay, going back to our game loop. We know that while this is executed, we're still in the game. So if we're out of it, means that we've left the game. So we either won or lost. So what we just need to do is wait a little bit more. So there's more of fine control over our timing in our game. You can all do it from a coroutine with just a wait for seconds. After that, we reset the array, which was just zeroing the whole array. It's probably not necessary because what happens next is setting the game state to game state title. And what was our previous state? It was game over or congrats. So now something funny will happen. Can you see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so now what will happen is we come back to our setter on the game state, and we know that the previous state is different from current state because our current state, our previous state would have been, say, game over, and our game state underscore is now the new value, which is title. And this switch statement takes us directly to game state title, which means reset game. And okay, it'll be even more interesting in a build. It will do the same. Actually, it's a good thing to test things like that because we're using the scene manager. And let me see. So I've built it out. So let's try an actual build of the game. It takes a while to load the assets. There should be a loader scene or something with a display. Instead it's just loading a big scene up front. That's also something that's okay. Hopefully our frame rate is now better. Okay, so that worked okay. Very important thing to test the build against what you're doing in the editor as well if you're going to release your game. Because lots of things can change, shaders can get broken, scene management might not work okay if you refer to things by build index, things like that, lots of things actually. So leave a little bit of time for troubleshooting for the actual standalone build. Always. Okay. As far as the camera cinematic, that was just a recorded camera move that I did, very simple one. So I did it straight up in Unity and Editor. I did the same thing for the point controller. Actually, let me spend a little bit of time on the points prefab. So that would be your run-of-the-mill kind of a power-up or collectible or whatever. So what's sitting in point? Let's see. Well, first thing is, okay, I tried to get a kind of a look that matches the retro vibe. I started with okay, sorry, I changed this albedo. I think originally I used this alpha blended image so that I had something like this. This required the point mesh to be dual-sided. So I actually did that quickly in Blender, and I don't know, I think actually it's points being small as they are, it's better if they're a single block. This is kind of like a little bit, it makes more sense maybe with the theme of the game, but it's not obvious enough. So those things like that, you know, aesthetics and visual kind of, you know.
Sorry, Rob.
Yep.
When you say that you had to make it dual-sided or two-sided, what do you mean by that?
Sure. Let me, because this is a standard material, and what the standard material by default does is that it will only render triangles which have, you know, your normal pointing toward you. So mesh grid block. If I use just our block from our game. Okay, this block has been badly texture mapped, but you kind of get the idea. Even where the UV map has something on it, we don't see anything that's on the other side of the block. So this geometry is single-sided.
Okay.
Actually, if I do a regular cube from here, what did I do? Oh, I broke something. Point. Select the point. Yeah, that's something that actually good that you're asking. It's something that you drawn in every once in a while because you might get that. So let's see. If you do a regular cube from just the Unity defaults and you use a material which is translucent, like we're doing. So I'm using here a material that has a cutout rendering mode, which means that it takes the alpha. So for example, remember that gradient which we made up?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just added this gradient as our main map, and we actually get something like this. And the cutoff parameter allows us to control where the opacity starts and begins. This is called alpha masking mode for rendering, and it's actually more performant than alpha blending. What I mean by that is there's less checks on the individual pixel level needed for rendering. So if you have lots of transparent objects like that, you're better off using cutout mode, because transparent mode requires quite a lot more happening there behind the scenes. So this is, for example, transparent, and albedo alpha doesn't maybe demonstrate it great. Give me a sec. Why doesn't it? Yeah. Okay. So this is like basically full alpha. So it's observing all the opacity from the texture and gives you this kind of effect. Meanwhile, cutout mode will just reduce it to a threshold. But you can get some nice effects out of it by, for example, animating this cutoff. You can get something that does something like this just in a simple, cheap way. So like if you know those kind of like low level tricks, you can get animation out of just a single material property, for example. So worth to know about. So going back to the material, the mesh being two-sided or one-sided. So this is like a mesh with just faces which have each face has a proper side, and then the other side is not visible. And that's what a lot of the rendering optimization, like triangles that are facing away from you, are assumed to be invisible, unless you're drawing something which is transparent, and then you have a problem. So then you need to make sure that you have two triangles there, or two quads. So let me kind of go maybe a bit more closely into it. So I'll jump into Blender just really quickly.
Is is there a certain way of doing this, or have you literally modeled a hollow block?
No, you can do it quickly. You can do it very quickly. Let's say, okay, I'll just import that FBX straight from the project. So I'll take the whatever I had to begin with. Well, let's say I think arches would be okay. Yeah, that's not. The original was the block. Yeah. Okay. So this is our block in Blender, and if I actually show, let me go to edit mode. And now I can show normals. I can see that this face has a normal pointing outwards. There's more. There's normals coming out of vertices. So this is the kind of, this would be important when you're actually looking for like a specific visual effect of a, crystal glass. Then you need sharp edges and stuff like that. Or if you want your illumination to behave in a kind of very flat-like polygonal way, then these things you need to, because if I change this now to smooth shading on all faces, I get crappy looking result like this, because now there's only one normal shared between all these vertices, and the lighting kind of just does kind of the best it can with the position of each vertex. If you know what I mean. So in this case, I'd have to select faces to be flat versus faces smooth. So this kind of effect. But anyway, what I wanted to show here is that this is a vector pointing outwards, the normal, and there's only one for each face. So this is what I mean by single-sided. So in order to make it two-sided, either I have to use a material which is specifically dual-sided, and it's possible to do it, just a special custom material with the calling flag off. So that would be something you change in the shader. But if you don't have this shader handy, then you can just make an extra set of triangles. So for example here, I would just the way I would do it, I would copy this whole Control D, sorry, not Control D, Shift D. No, it was actually Control D. Control D. What's wrong? Yeah, it's Shift D, and then press Escape. This ensures that we don't actually move the block from original position. If you see now here on the right hand side, I have two of the same. So let me hide one of them. I'll hide one block. I'll leave the other one on. Go to edit mode. And normals, flip direction. Now you can see that the normal is facing inside. And if you go to solid mode, rendering mode, you can kind of see that this looks like this. and the other block, let me go back to object mode. So there are two identical cubes, but their normals are facing the other direction. This one is lit like this, even in Blender, and this one is lit like this. So you can kind of see where the normal is pointing outwards and when it's not. So what I'm going to do is now select both of these and do Ctrl J, and then I have a single block that merges all this geometry. So edit mode, you see now I have actually 16 vertices, 24 edges, but it's still a single object. So now if I go to wireframe mode, you can see that I have normals pointing outwards and backwards. So I have basically duplicated the geometry. So this is what I did for this point originally. Not sure if specific case like that you need to do it like that often, but if you're dealing with transparencies and like you have stuff which is, you know, partly see-through, like you want to simulate foliage or something, then maybe it's easier not to use a double shader. Maybe it's better just to have it in one geometry, because then you can make it in a one draw call. Otherwise, a material which renders twice, it triggers two draw calls. So this kind of has to be done by the graphics card in 2 rounds. Anyway, so that was about the little material digression. I also added a secondary normal map. So I wanted to have a little bit of a feel of concrete or some kind of texture to the materials in the game. So that's what I did. I did it by using the secondary maps. So like if I use the normal map as a primary map, it just maps it, usually use just like a, you know, like this. It's just mapped straight up. So it's a one-on-one mapping to the UV map of the object. Secondary maps is where you can add textural elements. So for example, let me add that gradient map and just use tiling of 10. It didn't really work because for some reason this gradient texture is set to clamp. So instead I'll set it to repeat, okay, and apply. I'm not sure why I defaulted to clamp. I didn't set it up as clamp. Okay, so now I have a kind of a checkered box, whatever. Very easy. You can do the same thing with, you know, however, in this case I wanted normals, so I wanted the additional kind of lighting information to be affected by normals. You know what a normal texture is? This is what it is.
Gives a sense of depth.
Well, I wouldn't call it depth, it just adds variation to the way light is. So again, in Blender there, I was showing you normal, which was like just one single vector for a whole face. Well, what a texture normal gives you is that for every point of that face, you can slightly vary the normal vector, the kind of perpendicular vector to the surface, giving you a texture, and this interacts with lighting in a nice way, and it does give you, well, in a way, it does give you a sense of depth. It gives you a sense of texture. There's other things that you can do, and even in the standard material. I think there's if I go for specular setup, is there? Trying to look for no. Well, anyway, that's just in case you need, because maybe you'll want to have some billboards or some additional image elements. Then you know, remember that you have you can do a lot with materials and lighting. Okay, but what does the point actually do in the script? Let's have a quick look at that. And as expected, it's actually simple enough. So So once point gets spawned. Sorry, my screen okay because I can't really check before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So once the point gets spawned, and the point gets spawned by the tile, the road tile, the point is spawned deterministically by the tile. So if a tile is flat, it just spawns one point and that's it. It never spawns a point again. However, we need to keep track of them, so we just increment a static variable max loot of the game controller. So I didn't need a reference to game controller, I just used the static. It's like a global variable. Statics are like, basically globals. So I incremented by 1 max loot, and also I have an on trigger enter, which checks if the other object, the other collider's tag is player. What do you remember about this? What's the necessary condition for this to work?
The collider needs to be set to trigger.
Yes, and also there needs to be a rigid body involved. Like you cannot do it with 2 trigger colliders. So in this case, I think basically the rigid body is on the player, and the point only has a trigger collider. So okay, so we remember something, that's good. Game controller instance collect points. So basically here I'm using the static property of game controller, getting the instance of the game controller, and calling the method collect point, which just increments the player's loot stats. I could have probably done something else about it, like more like this in this fashion, but in case the player collects the point, more things need to happen. So I wanted to do it inside game controller, and then this is destroyed, so the point gets destroyed. Maybe a quick look at this. Just right click into this, go to implementation. Okay. There's a lot of additional methods in game controller which they don't deserve kind of spending too much time on individually. But this is what happens when you collect a point. So you you increment the player loot, you update the score UI, and you play the coin effects. So this is how it's all kind of organized. So now I'll verify what's going to happen next week about the lecture again. I think because you didn't have the first reading week, so we technically should have another lecture. How is your workload regarding other exams, and is it like a very tough time now?
Yeah, it would be at the moment. Just have a lot of things that we have to deliver over the next few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's say for this partial, let's call it creative coding thing with 3D. Let's say that the actual deadline for submission will be in 2 weeks. But next week we'll do a kind of a session where you can join in. You can work on it at home, or I'll double check if we have basically a lecture due. Then we can kind of like work on it together, so that you can kind of get your hands on and actually work toward already your final project stuff, so that it's kind of using your time best.
Rob, see for the mini assignment thing you're on about, the 3D.
Yeah.
Making whatever we want. Can we make whatever we want using any type of objects, or does it have to be using like the arches and stuff?
No, you don't have to use the arches. Like I talked about it before. Like you can use a different library of blocks, of course.
Oh.
But you can write your own placement structure yourself as well. I'm happy with it. This was kind of to give you options, so
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. Are you thinking about like having a larger library of them, or like are you thinking about some game assets, or?
Well, for the thing you're on about there, that's like the Blockly Games thing we did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I was thinking of using like some sort of fractal things with it, maybe, or something. I don't know, something like the stuff from Catlight Coding or something. Just
yeah, well,
like
you can use. I mean, like we are using something like the Catlight Coding demo there. The whole recursive root generation is basically like that sample. It's a fractal. The root is a kind of like you have 4 main roads and then they split off and whatever, and it's just kind of like we take some random steps along the way. But if you do it in a very regular way, you could create like a large scale of roads that is actually quite regular. So maybe that's an idea, because you can actually kind of like spawn it deterministically and create a big fern, like orbital space station, something where you can walk around it. So this really, like, your imagination is the limit.
that's great.
Yeah, okay. As long as there's like enough blocks to give a little bit of variation, and sure. But like I said, go along with this and try to flesh out your own idea using some bits that I give you here. Okay. Is there any other questions about I don't know, any other troubles you were getting with how is Git working out for you? Has everybody settled on source tree or using Git desktop, or is basically everybody happy with it by now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working out okay.
Let me just check. Okay, just checking if I made that. Some potential ideas now with stuff that be low-hanging fruit there, which I just didn't have enough time to implement. Like, we already worked on the shooting towers, so like there's no shooting happening in this game, but we already know where to start. We've made the turret, which worked quite well, so we could quite easily place some turrets in the city as well and make some kind of additional element to it. If somebody is interested in getting the kind of abstract side of it, like maybe some kind of overlay which shows you where in the array you are, as opposed to the real world location, that would be a nice thing to work on as well, like as a kind of something that is very topical to this lecture, that we're kind of trying to learn about using data structures and abstract stuff while representing them in a kind of a nice cartoony way. Let me see if there's Okay, yeah. One thing that I actually definitely ran into a problem with this setup is trying to get the player to be able to access all areas that it should be able to access, and this is because let's see. Because for a navigation mesh, you have certain parameters for the agent. The actual player. I'll go away. Actually, if I don't do anything, it should allow me to survive. So at least that's in that way it's handy. So here in the NavMesh agent, you have a specific setting for both speed of the agent throughout the NavMesh and for obstacle avoidance. And here, if you have a look, if you have a close look at our player, gizmos need to be enabled. you can see that there's two things happening. That there's the obstacle, the rigid body, the collider, and then there is the nav agent obstacle avoidance. So originally I had the height set up to 2, so only that's why those gizmos can be very helpful. If I left it like this, what's gonna happen? Well, quite obviously maybe, but not if you just start having problems and not see what's happening, is that some areas now are going to be completely inaccessible because, yes, there's a nav mesh coming on top of it, and there's not enough clearance. I can't kind of find exactly a quick sample. It would have to be an actually here it did. Maybe if I exaggerated more. I had some situations where like this blocked me, so watch out for this height. And how are your final project ideas coming along? Like, did you have a chance to get started on it? I know some of you have. Because next week would be also a good opportunity to, maybe talk about some problems and see if we can get you unstuck if you do come up with something. So.
Sorry, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Just on the final project, we submitted the pitch to you there last week.
Yeah.
How closely do you want us to follow that if we decide that we at some point that we want to pivot into something else?
Yeah, you don't need to stick too close to it if you find that the code stops you from doing something specific. That's life. I just kind of wanted you to get through the experience of having an idea, then confronting it with the limitations, and maybe coming up with something else. But it's still kind of learning. So next time you'll be making a project outline or a prototype, maybe you'll be a little bit wiser as to what was a problem. That kind of approach. It's just kind of hands-on and practical. Well, I think we have time for like one more tangent or specific area, so it's up to you. We have lots of pick any scripts that I wrote for this. I think there's enough to choose from, or maybe some other aspects of the implementation that are interesting. Or do you feel that you might have a problem? Because I get that the procedural generation was the biggest problem for everyone, because it's kind of like it's a little bit gnarly code, and also the C# syntax is something that you haven't necessarily all been trained in a kind of very kind of systematic way or whatever. On Unity side, I think we covered enough again to make something from scratch, so I kind of flew over some of the asset making when we were talking about animation. But I think Mixamo should help as well. Character control, so we have a character controller. It's not a typical one, it's using the agent nav mesh, so this would be something that you'd be more likely to use maybe for a point and click adventure game, where you kind of point to an area in the screen and the player flies there or runs there. What I did, and I didn't dwell on it, but maybe just worth it. Just a quick fly in. Unless I talked about it in the very beginning. Now I'm starting to lose kind of focus. Sorry. I think we spend more time on the baddie rather than the player, but the character, it's something that started with the script from Animation Lecture, and as you see, different states, dying and winning and so on. But the important part here is these 3 lines. So this kind of if you understand what's happening here, then you know what I'm doing with this character control. We know that we have a separate player agent which needs a destination, and that destination we pick by the orientation of the body right now, so which way the player is facing relative to the joystick input or the keyboard input. And the body transform position, the body follows the agent. I'm using the lerp just to smooth out the position, so I'm lerping between the current body transform position and the position of the agent. So that kind of gives me like preventing any potential jitteriness in the movement. And rotation, on the other hand, is just very quickly rotating to a target rotation. And the target rotation is something that's incremented by steps of 90. So right arrow, target rotation, we multiply it by quaternion around the y-axis 90 degrees, and minus 90 degrees for y when we press the left arrow. So that's it. That gives us the marriage between the nav agent and kind of something like a player controlled by keyboard. The danger here is that here this move vector is basically okay. We want our nav agent to. We need to point the nav agent to the position to the right of the player, and that's where it's going. But the agent itself is going to be turning around and doing all kinds of funny things, which you might not want the actual player to do. So the player's look rotation stays static in this case, and the agent is doing all kinds of twists and turns, but in the end we want only the position to mirror the nav agent, and rotation is something that we decide with our keyboard. So this was a kind of a important bit. I think if you decide to use the roads this way, then this is a kind of ready to go character controller. Like, you know, maybe tweak it and improve it if you want, but like I don't think there's that much to be done. In the other case, you have to worry more about colliders. So if you decide to go with a standard character controller, then make sure that you've got your collider set up correctly. So yeah, that was the dissection of Grid City. I think I managed to cover like most of the work I've done on this. So when you work on your final project, keep a running log just to make it a bit you know, easier to grade your actual effort. Keep a note of like the parts which you put work toward, because some of you might be using some external assets, some of you might be using parts of this Grid City code, so make sure you log your work in terms of, okay, I've modified the character controller in a way that it does this and that. Just, you know, keep it documented, and this way you can guarantee like a, you know, better grade, because it'll be easier to like kind of if it's an obscure small change that you spent a lot of time working on and I don't know about it, it'd be pretty difficult for me to find it. I mean, you know, just it certainly will help if you point out what you've done and what you focused on. So that's the place where those notes can go into the README of your Git repository. I think that would be not a bad place to keep it, or you can provide them separately, but I think that would be a good idea. If you don't do it, you know, it's just you're just, you know, risking a chance that I'll miss out some good bit of work just because you buried it somewhere deep in the code. Okay, well, let's have one last playthrough, and let's see if I can find some more jumping off points for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll finish up. One nice angle here that is possible is use a bit more spatialized sound. So by default, if you place audio sources on objects and relative to the audio listener, you will get some spatialization, some panning. If you work with VR, you usually kind of import additional spatializer plugins that make it very obvious where the sound is coming from relative to your head position, and it makes a huge difference actually. Like it really makes it much more direct and feels like you know, somebody's talking right to you, and so on. You can still do a lot of sound with sound using zones, and there's definitely a lot of angles that are possible. Maybe this isn't the focus of this class, but don't neglect sound, don't make it an afterthought, make it like part of your game world tapestry. And it's also quite easy to get, you know, quite a lot of more ambience and mood just by adding, you know, like a bird chirping sound or some kind of city noises. The whole thing feels much more immersive, obviously. Those simple things like the changing of the sky between each playthrough, well, I think that kind of stuff should be already second nature by now to you, but just as a quick hint, again, it's the game controller that does that, and basically sky matte array. There's an array of 6 materials that I've dropped. For each of the classes I've just made a little variant of this gradient skybox material, and now I just collect them all in an array and I randomize which one I use for every playthrough. The same for the Cartesian floor materials, but I think that's pretty visible at all. I think maybe and this is the big library of all the tower profiles, and we only select a couple of them for each game, so we have a little bit of consistency between the buildings. It makes it for a different looking city every time. So it's a little bit meta, because what the building profile is already a selection of different types of blocks. So we kind of like, you know, work on different levels of detail and selection of instead of just deciding everything at once. We make little groups, little prefabs of selections and sets of blocks that we use, and then we randomize those. Together with colors, we can work on a slightly higher level to get a different aesthetic effect. For example, I just played in a Mediterranean-like city with white walls and blue domes and stuff, and now we get another Mediterranean city, because most of these actually look like this, to be honest. But you can do quite a lot of different vibes out of that. That's also kind of worthwhile to play with the style and using minimal set of elements. Here the normals kind of play off nicely because I used a slightly more metallic material, so this plays well with the lighting and gives you a nice kind of gradient, kind of a bit more realistic. Well, it's still cartoonish and still kind of like stylized, but it adds a little bit of visual interest. So that's also quite interesting. You can also see a little bit of MIP mapping coming into place. If you look at this, these normals there, you see that the bottom part, which is closer to us, seems much more detailed than the top one, which is further. So this is the MIP mapping of the normal texture being visible. This is MIP mapping means that there's different layers of resolution for different textures. So for example, if I go to tile normal texture, noise tile normal, this is the texture that I've used for this. If I disable generate MIP maps now, bing, and everything now looks like this, and it's much more expensive to process because it always uses the highest level of resolution for this and actually this causes a kind of a shimmering effect. It's not very nice. This is actually kind of like a bad effect. You can filter it more, but that doesn't actually help you too much. So usually MIP maps are the way to go, to be honest, both for performance and for look. But maybe if you're making a very stylized game, then you know, maybe you want this. So you know your settings, know a little bit of the rendering pipeline. I don't know. It kind of like, it doesn't look too bad. It's interesting. It shimmers very much. You couldn't use it, say, in a VR game because it would look different for each eye, and would be quite unpleasant to work with. Okay, so that's all I got for today. I hope you enjoy playing the game and dissecting it and turning it apart and inside out, and we'll do more of that next week.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, how are you?
Not too bad. How
How's
are
things?
you?
Yeah, I'm good.
I just wanted to just give you kind of an update because I wasn't there last week when
Yep.
people were handing stuff in. I don't, and
It's
because of
not.
that, I just
It's not a
don't really
problem.
have it.
It's not a
Yeah.
problem. I just, as long as I eventually get it.
Yes.
So the idea, the outline. So I think, let me check. Did you already submit it there, or?
I haven't submitted
Okay.
the write up for it yet, but I'm gonna get around to it. I just wanted to ask you a few things about it. That's
Sure.
why.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I guess what I wanted to do was I wanted to give you kind of because I'm not really the best at coding, so I wanted to give you kind of a scene of randomization as opposed to a game of randomization.
Yep.
I guess my scene was just going to be a car just driving down while a city just spawns randomly as the road goes.
That can
you
be
know?
cool. Yeah. That can be cool.
Yeah, okay.
So, well, I mean, again, like, don't give up too easy on trying to make
I know,
it somewhat
I want
interactive, but we'll see. I mean, if you
I would like that to be the basis
sure.
of it. At
Yeah,
least,
that's
and then
fine.
we
That's
kind of
fine. It
expand on
doesn't
that.
need to be, like, I don't expect, I don't expect kind of it wouldn't be realistic to expect a fully featured game. I mean, it's possible
Sure.
if you have a whole team, you can do it like a hackathon type approach, or like what I did there with the Grid City. Did you play it yet?
I haven't actually, because I've actually managed to just assemble my computer over the weekend.
Okay, gotcha.
Essentially.
Well, because that was another reason why I did it this way, is that you have a template and kind of a potential reference if you want to play around with those ideas yourself. Because
Cool.
because I mean, yes, some of these bits of code are a little bit maybe a little bit arbitrary. Like this is how I decided to do it, because I was doing it in a short amount of time and kind of like slapped it together. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot that one can use out of it and put it together, like modify it, maybe take chunks that you need for your own project. But that car driving, if it's going to be procedural and interesting, I think that could be quite a nice project. So you're thinking that you'll be focusing more on the aesthetics, kind of? And,
Yeah, I think
mhm.
so. Essentially, I wanted to just make a really kind of low poly, like a Toyota Sprinter or something,
Nice. I like
and
that. Well,
then just have randomized.
is there
already.
is there going to be any interactivity? Like, can you control the car, or is it?
I would like to get that. I would like
Yeah.
to try and do that.
Okay, that would be great.
Definitely. But I said just for a basis, just so I know kind of where I am on my footing, I would like to just get a scene down first.
Yeah, that's a good start. Like I said, hold on. Let me just get my. A bit fried after the 7 hours, so next week we'll be doing the little bit of kind of assisted coding already toward that.
Sure.
I don't know if you managed to catch up on the, or were you there?
You see, I usually have to kind of fight my boss to get the day off on
Yeah,
Wednesday.
I get it.
you
No
know?
problem. So I'll record what happened now. Is I'm gonna put the 4 hours from the second group, because my computer crashed, so I lost a little bit of the recordings. But what happened today is I submitted to the Git repo on the final game branch. You have a kind of full complete game using the Grid City generation. So
Cool.
pretty much all the subsystems like audio, UI, AI, some bits that might help with debugging, game loop. So I talked about it. So I think this is actually quite a worthwhile lecture today, because it's practical, and I try to like give you practical tips about maybe making some image assets, and maybe if you need to do some quick recompression in audio. So there's kind of like a lot packed in there. So I will post that later today or tomorrow. Like I think right now I need a bit of a breather.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So sounds good. And well, just get me that outline when you kind of.
Yeah, I'll give you the right.
Are you calling it Outrun or something?
Well, no, because I know that Kevin is doing something quite similar to Outrun.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
actually would like to go in the kind of opposite direction, where because I guess I kind of have a handle on the tool itself, like Unity itself, but not coding.
Mhm.
So I'm very familiar with kind of setting up a scene and adding shaders to it and kind of
Okay, so you're a
a few
shader guy.
models here and there.
Mhm.
So I'd like to make something that emulates a PlayStation 1 game as
Oh, nice.
opposed to.
That's a nice. I like that. I mean,
Yeah.
what I did with this Grid City thing, I wanted to go for like a retro, like a kind of a Amiga game by Psygnosis or something like that. So yeah, I like hitting a specific. It's nice retro.
Like my
Did you play?
inspiration-
Did you play Broken Reality? Maybe.
No, I haven't.
Oh, damn
I'll
it!
write
Like
that down.
yeah, it's great. Like it's such a load of cheese. Like this kind of a
Yeah.
Windows 95 style internet visualized as a kind of a William Gibson cyberpunk thing using low res graphics.
Yeah,
really good.
I'm obsessed with like 90s Japanese street racing.
Oh, you
culture as well.
like it, yeah.
Yeah. And there's this game I find really fascinating that never left Japan called Racing Lagoon, which is Squaresoft's version of a street racer.
Mhm.
It's essentially like an RPG.
Mhm. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a Squaresoft RPG from the 90s, but it's about street racing. It's a very
Okay.
bizarre concept, but I love the art from it,
Well,
and that's going to be kind of my
Trust-
point of design.
Trust the Japanese to do that. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I know, right?
Okay.
But that, yeah.
All right. So I think we're set, right? We're cleared.
Yeah,
And,
I can get started on it properly then, yeah.
Yeah, and if you, because you weren't there for the lecture, so we negotiated a bit, and like I'm not gonna pose it as a lab test 2 next week. It's going to be more like a partial assignment, partial delivery of the procedural stuff with emphasis on specifically making procedural buildings in the scene. So we can maybe discuss specifics, but I want it to be the equivalent of what we did with the turtle graphics, only in 3D using a little bit of code basically, because otherwise you don't want to be placing stuff by hand all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. All right then.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you very
No
much,
problem
Rob.
at all. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Look after yourself. See you
You too.
later.
Take care, man.